And so tonight I'm going to be talking mostly about the Enneagram and using the Enneagram as a tool for practice. And last month I talked about working with personality patterns. And there's a great article by a Buddhist scholar called Bhikkhu Bodhi called Taking Stock of Oneself. And it's kind of pointing at this idea of, in practice, really having an honest self-assessment of our own patterns as part of our, ongoing practice. And I often will encourage people when they're practicing, when they're on the cushion, to notice, the top 2 or 3 patterns that are continually taking them off of the breath. So you might have noticed that as we were just meditating. But, over a longer course of practice, we can see that it's a limited number of patterns. The contents might be different, but the actual pattern is consistent, that we can narrow it down to, say, even the top 2 or 3 can be really interesting, because we find that those same patterns are the ones that we're running into off the cushion in our life. And it's not enough to just transcend, we really need to work with the patterning. And in the old days, there was this idea that, well, we didn't need to because it's all empty anyway, so just ignore those thoughts. And I'm not saying there isn't a truth in that. There is a truth in it. And at the same time, it's just not helpful psychologically, because it leads to things like spiritual bypassing. So, there are ways now, fortunately, with the advent of psychology, we have ways to work with these patterns, and to, instead of just like trying to, parachute over them, or a lot of them will, the more superficial patterns will thin out just from practicing. And that's why people see so much relief even after 6 weeks of meditating in the MBSR studies. People had so much more freedom. But as we get deeper in our practice, the deeper the layers of our personality, the more tenacious they are. And this is really where a tool like the Enneagram can be helpful. I mean, it can be helpful all along, but it's particularly helpful in looking at those deeper layers and also getting some space from them. This is part of what we're doing in practice, is getting some space with identifying with these patterns, or with the self-images around the pattern. I'm a smart person, I'm a dumb person, I'm an athletic person, I'm a clumsy person. All these, we have tons of self-images that also make up, these are the building blocks of the me, of the personality, of the ego self, that it's possible to thin out and digest. And these are also what blocks us from really having direct experience of our deeper nature, which is where the real freedom lies, is when that can start shining through. So in psychology, and most of psychology, a healthy ego is the endpoint. And that's an extremely worthwhile goal, because if we have a healthy ego self, it's much more able to withstand the pressures of a spiritual path where we're actually thinning the me. But on the spiritual path, we're looking at going beyond that, going beyond the healthy ego self, and really understanding what we are that is, that's beyond that. So this is part of where the Enneagram becomes a really helpful tool on the path of working with the patterning, and even more so understanding how our consciousness has turned away from the ground of being and is taking something else to be its ultimate refuge. So instead of having the ground of being as our ultimate refuge, the whole process, and I'll get into how this works, of coming into a body and so on, because these body things are pretty fragile, and we need some survival instincts to keep them going. And it's a good thing we have those instincts. And last year I gave 3 talks on the survival instincts that all mammals have, and one on what's called the enlightenment drive. So you might listen to those talks if you haven't yet. They're for free on Dharma Seed and on our YouTube channel. But the Enneagram, when it's used as a spiritual tool, it really helps us at the very deepest level. It helps us see what we rely on for our sense of value and safety, that is the ego self instead of the grounded being. And that's pretty helpful on the spiritual path. So the origins of the Enneagram are kind of mysterious. It's mostly thought at this point that it came out of a mystical group in the Middle East called the Sarmoon Brotherhood, the White Brotherhood, and came to Gurdjieff, who was a teacher, I think in the 1800s. It's been a while, but not too long ago. And then through Uspensky and people like Claudio Naranjo and Oscar Ichazo and others. And now there's a wide variety of Enneagram teachers, but it came from it was designed as a spiritual tool for this purpose. Part of what's happened, though, which happens with pretty much every spiritual tradition or tool over time, it's like if you listen to a lot of the Enneagram teachings out there, it's actually just reinforcing the ego, telling people like, okay, here's what your ego is like, and now you can become more identified with it and use it as an excuse as to why I'm just like that, So if you're a person who, say, is really conflict avoidant, and this is part of your Enneatype, then some of the Enneagram teachings that don't use it as a spiritual tool oftentimes are just actually using it as an excuse to be more in the ego. So this is where, I like to really make clear that you need to be careful which Enneagram teachings you're utilizing. And I recommend Rizzo and Hudson, The Wisdom of the Enneagram is a great book. Anything they do is great. And they have an online assessment that you can take for like $12. That'll at least help you narrow down. Sandra Maitre, she's been a teacher of mine for 17 years now. She's a teacher in the Diamond Approach and is one of the most well-known Enneagram teachers, and all of her books utilize it as a spiritual tool. There's also a newer teacher out named Beatrice Chestnut, who's written a book called The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up. It's brutal, but she tries to do it in a soft way, and I found that is also a useful book, and she has some great things on the internet also. So those are just three. There are others I would encourage you to avoid, but I won't say their names since I've given you ones that I think are some of the best to go to for this purpose of spiritual freedom and using it for understanding for that. So the Enneagram, you've probably seen a diagram maybe like this of the Enneagram, and you can find this online. You don't need to memorize everything on there, but you can see that there are 9 points around the outside, and then there are lines that go from different points to each other. So this is the graphic representation of the Enneagram. And what it's showing is that in this typology, there are 9 ways that consciousness turns away from the grounded being. And of course, within this, there's tons of variation. No two people are the same. So, we have to take everything we read with a grain of salt. And if you feel you have a certain Enneatype, or you're exploring Enneatypes that you think might be the one that you're that describes your way of turning away from the grounded being. Not everything in those descriptions is going to apply to you, but if a lot of it applies to you, then you can at least use it as kind of a template. That's how I would encourage you to see it. But it's not going to be 100%, but if you can start getting a feel, and now that I've worked with literally thousands of people on it, I can really feel each Enneatype. And it's just been incredibly useful. I mean, I even used it in my coaching of executives. I never told them I was doing it, but I could sort of tell what their Enneatype was, and I would use it in my work with them, and it just was a shortcut. It was so much, it was helpful, it was practical. So I'll go through then. You can maybe see on here, there's a triangle in the middle of the Enneagram here. And it just so happens, which I love, that this inner triangle mirrors the 3 defilements of Buddhism. So Buddhism is already there inherently in the Enneagram. It's like the Enneagram is just an expansion of what the Buddha, found 2,600 years ago. So we already have delusion, aversion, and desire as really the core inner, what's known as the inner triangle of the Enneagram. And so I'm just going to go through the Enneagram understanding of how is it that consciousness turns away from the grounded being. I mean, sometimes when you read Buddhism and hear it, it's like, are we just born to suffer and die? Is that the whole point of human existence? And that's not very inspiring. And also, I don't think it's true. I think that and you can see from this understanding that the formation of the ego is a part of the human condition. As far as we know, there's never been a human who didn't have an ego self-develop, even the Buddha. Because without the ego self-developing, there's no capacity for self-reflection. So like animals have consciousness, but most animals, there may be a few that are self-aware. We're not sure yet since we can't speak to them, but that might change soon. But they don't know they're conscious. There's no self-reflective capacity for them to know what their thoughts are. So animals and also infants are the grounded being. There's no obscuration from the grounded being, but they also don't know that they're the grounded being. They just are the grounded being. And that's how we come in as infants. There may be a few animals like the apes, which is basically what we are, and cetaceans, whales and dolphins, elephants, canines, and a few others who may have self-reflective capacity. But as far as we know, we can only confirm that we're the only ones that we know for sure have it. So as infants, we come in, an infant is born and does not have a me. There's no sense of a separate self. An infant comes in just as like an animal, being one with the grounded being, but not having the self-reflection. And so an infant doesn't really know that it's separate from its caregiver. And it's in what's known as dual unity. This is all in psychology. This isn't Buddhism. I'm telling you something from psychology. And then as the infant starts encountering things that go wrong, like needing food, needing comfort, not getting it, needing, diaper changed, other things that are unpleasant. I mean, infants, they ask for what they need. There's no question there that they are telling you that they are needing that. And over time, all of these solutions to this, all the good stuff comes from beyond the edge of the skin here. It comes from what comes to be experienced as outside. So over time, there's this sense of I end here at the end of the skin, and there's another who is coming and giving taking the hunger ends when this other comes. I mean, not an infant's not saying this, obviously, but it starts to, the consciousness that has become laminated and like affixed to the physical body, as consciousness comes into form, it has to attach to a physical body. There's no other way to have an experience in the physical realm, which is what we're in as humans. But consciousness isn't bound by the body. that's why we can meditate and have experiences that are not bounded by the body. If consciousness was bound by the body, that wouldn't be possible. So babies come in and they have, the consciousness isn't bound, but it has to get affixed to the body so we can have a human experience in the physical realm. So over time, the infant starts realizing, I end here at the end of the skin, and the good stuff comes from outside. So there's a sense of over time being separate. And like a child under the age of 2, you can't say, I'm going to the store to this child. You have to say, mommy's going to the store, daddy's going to the store, because they don't know what I means. They have no reference point for I. But then around the age of 2, the terrible 2s, they start getting a sense like, me do it, and they want to do stuff themselves, and they start running off, and then they get all worried and come back. And over that next period, the sense of the me starts, and they can actually start using the word I. And this is the beginning of the ego self. Before that, there's no ego self. And so then over the next, basically rest of our life, but really the main ego identity gets formed between like 2 and 8 or 9. And this is when, based on what we came in with, so there's a nature element of what we came in with. In Buddhism, we would understand this as karma and other things maybe. And then there's a nurture element of our environment, and how, if you have children, if you have more than one child, or if you have siblings, you can see that they come in with different personalities. Even twins don't come out exactly the same, even though they came in at the same time and were raised by the same parents. So there's clearly something we come in with. But then our Enneatype shows us how we would respond in that environment, where different kids faced with the same exact circumstances, one might rebel, one might buckle under. So this is part of the nurture part, is how we end up responding. And then at some point, some things get reinforced in our environment that are wanted, also in our culture. The fact that males are not supposed to cry or show emotions, females aren't supposed to be good at math and science, all these cultural, and then not to even, then there's all the racial, conditioning, ethnicity, all of these things, physical ability, all of the dimensions of diversity also have cultural conditioning that tells us who we are through society, through parents, through teachers, religion, and over time. And we do what we have to be okay in our environment. So we take on these personality beliefs about who we are. Some of them are positive, some are negative, but they become self-images. And at a certain age, I think there's a period, I think, that goes up to about 5, where what's called object constancy gets established, where inside we have an image of ourself and also the other. And so that way, when a child, it's actually a huge achievement that a child's caregiver, usually the mother, can be out of the room, and in the mind, they still have a picture of the caregiver, so that that person can be gone and they aren't freaking out. And this is called object constancy. So at that point, we have a self-image and an image of an other, and they're separate. So this is really where that sense of I am the body and I am separate is established. So you can see how early this is, and how profound and deep our early childhood conditioning really is. I mean, it's kind of scary, actually, to see the layers that get established then, and everything else is just getting layered on top of that, mostly reinforcing it. And then the superego comes in, which the function of the superego is to keep the ego in line. So it's also an internalization of things that'll keep us safe, like, don't look both ways before you cross a street, things like that. But it also becomes the voice in our heads that is either critical or sometimes makes us grandiose. There can be a positive superego that tells you when you're doing it right. So, but basically the whole role of that is to keep us in the ego. So at some point I'll give a talk on this. I gave one last year actually on the superego. So if you want to know more about that, you can listen to that. So, so the inner triangle, then the 0.9 is at the top. And I'll just show you here. 0.9 is at the top, 0.6 is down here, and 0.3 is here. So at the top of the Enneagram at 0.9 is this is where consciousness turns away from the grounded being, and this equates to delusion. Delusion being the primary defilement in Buddhism, where we basically fall asleep on ourselves. And that is one of the characteristics of the Enneatype 9 is falling asleep on oneself. Not that we don't all do that, but it's more predominant with that Enneatype. So we come in, we take ourselves to be the body and the personality, and and at some point, kids lose touch with the grounded being. And they think they are the body and the personality. And that's happened to all of us. And it's a normal part of human development. It's just not the end point. On the spiritual path, we have the chance to go beyond that. And if we're lucky, we have a healthy enough ego that it supports our doing that. So then once we turned away, then down at 0.6, the children, like when they're 2 or 3, they're like putting everything in their mouths, they're running off, they feel invincible. And as they start falling down, they look around and there's no caregiver and they freak out. They realize, I'm vulnerable. I can get hurt. I can get scared. And I am really scared and all alone. And that is 0.6, which is really about aversion. And in the case of the Enneatype 6, fear and, the relation to the authority, either fighting against the authority or doing what the authority says. All of this is big, but fear, and which is part of aversion in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, aversion includes anger, hatred, and fear. So that's, so we have this fall from the unity, and then we realize how vulnerable we are in the physical realm, which is true. And so what do I need to do to solve that problem? Over to Enneatype 3, I need to be a really good doer. I need to achieve and perform and make sure no one else is going to take care of me. I got to take care of myself, and I better get really good at it too. And this is pretty much for all of us, the fall from knowing our deeper nature and the descent into the ego self and the complete identification with the ego self, to the point where if I'm not a good doer, maybe I won't survive. The problem is that the personality gets laminated to the actual survival instinct, so that when our personality gets threatened, we feel like we're going to die, like it's a threat to ourselves. This is why if someone gets insulted, we see people in road rage incidents and somebody cuts them off in traffic, and 10 minutes later, they've shot that person and killed them. I mean, that's how identified people are with just being cut off in traffic. So this is how identified we can get to just having a personality slight. It's not actually a survival issue, but it feels that way to us because we're so identified with the personality. And none of us are going to go do that. But what is our version of that? We all have some version of that where the identification is just so strong, and it causes, this is what the Buddha was pointing to. This is what causes suffering, is that, pain will happen in life. It's inevitable. But that second arrow of the suffering that gets added, that's the wiggle room that we have in Buddhism. Can we keep thinning that out? And then the more we thin that out, and the less identification we have with both the personality and the body. I mean, bodies are wonderful. You know, we have to have them to be in this realm. But if we think that's all we are, we're really shortchanging ourselves. So that's where the suffering comes from. So this is really how the Enneagram, and then of course at point 3 is desire. I got to get the stuff I need to be okay. And it's true, we do need things as physical beings, but you know, desire is where that is, all of these become compulsions to where we suffer because of them. So in the Enneagram, then, the way that it works is that, especially the way it's understood, how I've learned it, and also as a spiritual tool, is that you have one Enneatype. Like sometimes when I do my year-long mentoring program, people come in and they'll be like, well, I have this part of this and this, and this. So I'm these 3 types. And it's like, that's not really going to help you on the spiritual path. And it's not how it works, actually. So sometimes it takes people a little time to really try on a few different Enneatypes. It's helpful to work with a teacher, work with an Enneagram person. Some people are real clear about what their type is, and that's fine, but it could take a while. That's okay. You can try on a type and then see how it fits. But I do recommend the Enneagram assessment on the Rizzo Hudson site. The assessment on there for the instinctual drives I found really isn't very good, so I don't recommend that. But I do recommend the Enneagram one that at least can narrow down. So that is what we have taken to be the way that we're a good doer. So remember, I talked about the fall where we end up identifying with the ego self because I better do this really well because that's how I value and that's how I stay safe, instead of our refuge being our deeper nature, which in Buddhism is the 3 refuges, but really those are all pointing to our deeper nature as the refuge that is always there. It's not based on circumstances. When we're in touch with our deeper nature, it is a reliable refuge. And this is what we take in to be the refuge instead. So every Enneatype, you know, we feel that our value comes from doing that thing, from that particular identification. And so then, like, what if I'm not doing that thing? Like the 2 Enneatype, you know, the giver, the helper, is about helping others. There can be some issues with that, but you know, there can also be a lot of genuine wanting to help. But what if I'm not helping? Do I value them? So that, you know, this is the question. Every Enneatype has a thing that they has become a replacement for our inherent value just from existing. And so all the layers of the personality get stacked on that. So there's a lot of you know, complexity to the Enneagram, but basically, you know, landing on an Enneatype is kind of the first step. And then there are the types to the side, so that's called wings. So each type could be flavored by the predominant wing next to it. So like a 2, the helper, with a 3 wing that's more about achieving and performing would be different than a 2 that has the perfectionist as the wing. You can see how that flavor is a little different. So each Enneatype, you know, has usually I think everybody pretty much has both wings, but one's going to be more predominant. And then there's what's called there are lines on the Enneagram with arrows. So if you know, work with the Enneagram, you can see that each type has what's known as a heart point and a stress point. So the stress point is what we go to when we're really under so much stress that it's like we're almost like backed against a wall, and often it will become very different than our core Enneatype. The stress point looks different. than our Enneatype. And that can be another way of understanding what your Enneatype is, to see what the stress point is and what the heart point is, the potential for when we're feeling pretty fulfilled and the ego self is relaxed, we include more of what's known as the heart point. And that can be actually really good for spiritual growth, to explore the heart point. And I think I won't say a whole lot more about that. And then the last thing I'll just touch on is the instinctual drives, and which drive is the most predominant. So again, I'll go to the two, the helper, the giver. A self-preservation too. When self-preservation is the primary instinctual drive, there's going to be a lot more focus on things in our life as a source of security. The next drive is the sexual instinct, or the one-on-one instinct. So that's really about having that special other, or several special others, if we want to include friends, that are really make life good and complete. And if I have that, I'm gonna, I rely on that a lot as a source, as a refuge. So those people think a lot about romantic relationships, especially. And then the people who are predominant in social instinct, it's about the tribe. So, when we're all pack animals, basically. And in the old days, if they wanted to really, the worst punishment was to kick you out of the tribe, because even today, if we look at wolf packs, this is the worst punishment for a wolf, is to be kicked out, because a wolf by themselves isn't all that likely to survive. And the same thing was true of us until really recently. And maybe it's still true in a lot of ways. So the person where that's predominant will have put a lot of attention on groups, either being part of groups or rejecting groups, but there's a lot of attention there. So it's really, we can see our instinctual drive by where the most attention goes. And we all have all three, but they're usually, one is most predominant, one is least, and then there's one in the middle that's usually, somewhat balanced. And that will also flavor our Enneatype. But when we start working with this, I've been working with the Enneagram, gosh, how old am I? 30 years, probably, maybe a little more. And I'm still learning things about myself that are helpful on the spiritual path. So it's something that really is, it's a tool. It is not a spiritual path in itself, but it is a tool that can really help to see the things that are so inherent to who we feel we are that we can't even see them. So it can become kind of a shortcut to understand and have compassion for ourselves as to why that's there, and to start digesting it and disidentifying from it. So I will stop there and see if there are any. I know that was a very quick tour through the Enneagram, but really, this is just to help you see if this is something you're interested in. Some people just aren't, and that's fine. But if you are, how would you go about using it, working with it? So any comments or questions about what I've been talking about? Yes, Zoe. Oh, where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, I love that you talk about this. I've been working with the Enneagram a little bit, so I was excited that there was a merging of my two interests. My question is, would you talk a bit more about the Enneagram in terms of clinging? Buddhism has a lot of discussion of clinging to views, like the clinging aggregates. How might that manifest? And the clinging is a form of turning away, right, from the ground of being. So
Yeah.
if you could comment more on And maybe like give it like a case study type, like how A type would cling. And if you want to use type 5, that'd be great, but any type.
Is that your Enneatype 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, 5, the observer clings often to knowing things. I mean, that can tend to be a more, a type that will cling to knowing. And that can be different kinds of knowing. It doesn't have to be like scholarly. It can be other kinds of knowing, but and sort of wanting to hoard that. And while also turning away a lot. There's a lot of seclusion that 5s often will want. Even there aren't a lot of extroverted 5s, but even the extroverted 5s will want that, to where like is getting away is that's the safe place, is to go and to get away from people and to have their own place inside their mind that is safe and can be endlessly explored forever, because you never get to all the end of the information, or whatever it is that person is really interested in. And, it just could go on forever, the depth of which 5s, this is why 5s are, great specialists at things, because they just can go deep, deep, deep in a specialized area. But the clinging is that's the safety zone. So if I just could get enough of that, everything's going to be okay. So this is every Enneatype, it's a great question, because every Enneatype has a lot of things that we cling to. And of course, there's just things that are endemic to just the human experience. But for the Enneatype, it helps us see how we're doing that compulsively. And more, yes, it's good to have information. It's good to be alone sometimes, but each of us as an Enneatype will do it beyond, there's a compulsion there that also is what we are turning to instead of the grounded being. So this is where, as we really unhook from that compulsion and see how we're doing it, and see both how much we like doing it and how much suffering we've had from doing it, that hot coal of the clinging, the Enneagram can really help us see that the delusion, part of the delusion is we think this is actually going to be our salvation. But then over and over, we see that, yeah, there's a comfort there, but it isn't actually our salvation, but we want it to be, because we have trusted that over the grounded being. So does that make sense for using a 5? Yeah, so it's a great question, because really clinging is kind of at the core of the Enneatype, is clinging to beliefs that thing will be our salvation. And as long as we have that, then I'm going to be okay. So we keep trying to get it. And sometimes we're good at it. We do get it temporarily, and that feeds into the delusion. But at some point, for every Enneatype, you can see just the level of pain that clinging to that thing has caused. So that's where it can be a great tool to really flesh that out in a lot of different ways. Because I'm oversimplifying the Enneatypes, but there's, as you know, a lot more complexity to the Enneatype than just one aspect of it. Does that make sense? Thanks for the question, Zoe. Margaret.
Hi.
Hi.
I am thinking of a couple months ago, maybe it was the first meeting, you had a graph or a chart, and there was a mountain and various paths up the mountain. And now I'm wondering if it makes sense, or you would recommend thinking about which path up the mountain would work better for a certain Enneagram type. And I am also a 5, so if you have any additional thoughts on paths and 5s, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What would work best well, when people are starting off in practice, I really encourage people to go to the practices that are easiest. So, well, I don't know. What practice has been what have you preferred, Margaret?
I tend to do a lot of Vipassana.
Vipassana. I was going to say Vipassana. I should have said it before you answered. Yes, go ahead. Right, because the investigation. I mean, that's a big part of the 5 is the investigating. And there are some people that think the Buddha was either a 5 or a 1. So, you know, but yeah, the investigating, the wanting to know it all, wanting to know everything about experience, that would seem to be a natural for a 5 Enneatype. You know, the heart practices would be naturals for like 2, 9, 4, maybe, you know. So yeah, I think you could make a guess at what Enneatypes might like, what practices better. But I usually encourage people to go to what they're drawn to and what's easiest, because if you're drawn to it and it's easy, then you'll start getting some momentum behind your practice. But then at some point, we need to start doing our less preferred, you know, of the categories of the 4: focused attention, heart-based, open monitoring, and self-transcending. We need to start going to the ones that we aren't as drawn to, because those are going to be our not well-developed areas that are really most likely blocking us in ways that are more profound than the ones that are easy for us. You know, so ultimately, I think people should really do all 3 of the foundational categories. And then when those are fairly well established, then to do the self-transcending, like doing Dzogchen, because you really need the others to do that. And then I would put, like, in the mountain diagram, embodiment is across the bottom. You know, the Enneagram could be useful going up the mountain, but is also part, I you know, really think of it as an embodiment practice, because, or as a tool for embodiment, because you can really start using it off the cushion to see your pattern, because whatever your Enneatype is, you're going to see it on the cushion and you're going to really see it off the cushion. And that starts weaving the on and the off the cushion together more seamlessly. So we're not just, you know, practicing for 30 minutes or an hour a day where we're meditating, but we're using our whole life as practice, which, you know, is a great thing about the Enneagram, is it's really useful for both. Yeah, so have you done the heart practices?
Yeah, when you said you should do the one that's the most challenging to you, that's the clear answer for me. So yeah, that's been an emphasis lately, because I really noticed the need and the challenge. So I'm
good. That's great. I'm glad to hear you're doing that. Yeah. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Sure. Joe Bath.
Hi, Tina. It's good to be back with you again.
Good to see you.
I'm a beginner at this. I realized it was out there, and I was fascinated by it, but I never went deep at all into it, because I just didn't have the right tools. And you mentioned some things about books and assessments, and I just need to hear that again so that I can make notes of that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I just set up, no, we don't have that on the website anywhere. So the website, if you put in Rizzo, RISO -Hudson, Rizzo Hudson, these are -Hudson, HUDSON, and Enneagram, it will take you to their site. These are 2 men who have done a lot of work. One of them is deceased now, but the other one's still teaching. And that is where the online, it's like $12 or something, Enneagram test is that you can take, and it'll give you, rank you on the top ones, and then you can get a summary of the top couple of types, and you can read through that and compare and say, really feel into like which one do you want to explore. It's really up to you what you feel your Enneatype is, but that would be the best way to start exploring.
Okay.
Would be to go to that site. And then their book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, I think is a great starting point. Oh yeah, thank you, Jeannie. Jeannie put the EnneagramInstitute.com and then Reti. So if you want to copy the link off of the chat, you can get it there. Thank you, Jeannie. Yeah. So that would be a great place to start. And then the book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, would be, I think, the next, which is written by them also, would be a next great.
Sounds like there's plenty to get going on.
Yeah. But a lot of it you can get for free. A lot of what they've done you can get for free on the internet on their site. That is my recommended way to start, is to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to do the 16th and 17th with you when you're up in Avalok. I'm really excited to be able to join you that weekend. So yeah.
Oh, good. Also in person or on
Tucson,
Zoom?
so.
On Zoom.
Yeah.
Good. I look forward to seeing you there. Somebody else had their hand up, I think. Oh yeah. Hi, Debbie.
Hi. Yeah, and I was wondering for like I had done some of the beginning stuff already, and so I was wondering what your suggestion was for moving forward once you've already done some of that beginning work. And I wondered if one of the third book you suggested, or whatever thoughts you might have.
Yeah, because Debbie's in the mentoring program, so we've been working with this for a while. And so I would recommend, have you looked at the Rizzo Hudson book? I mean, have you looked at that at all?
I didn't read it cover to cover, but I looked at it, probably a year ago.
Yeah, well, just looking at your type. The other really cool thing that I love that they do is the levels. So they have levels from like really low functioning all the way to like a fully enlightened person of that Enneatype. And I love, you can find this online if you don't want to buy the book, a chart of their levels. I love the levels because it sort of shows that we can kind of see where we are and where maybe we were early in our life and where we could aspire to, like if we really were free of the personality. So, take a look at your own Enneatype in there. You don't really need to read the rest of the book, although it's fascinating if you want to find out about your significant others in your life. And then either Sandra Maitre's book, The Spiritual Dimension of the Enneagram, is a great one. And the third one has just come out. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read enough chapters to feel like I can really recommend it. It's called The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up, by Beatrice Chestnut. And I just love the way she does it because she starts each chapter really showing how the exact journey I described of how that Enneatype sort of comes in and what it is that they're trying to protect against and defend against, and then how that takes them away from being. And then there's questions that are, frankly, they're really pointed and they're hard to read, but they will give you some ways to work with it that are a little bit more in your face than what you might find in the Wisdom of the Enneagram. Sandra's book can be a little bit in your face, but the Beatrice Chestnut book, I think, is the most direct. And it's also really useful for like, how do you work with it?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I remember that spiritual dimension, looking at that book, that felt like that was hard to read back then.
Really
so
hard
maybe
on twos because Sandra's a 2. And so she's harder on 2s than any of the other types, in my opinion. So
yeah, and I'm a 2. So maybe that's why I didn't really enjoy that. I remember.
Yeah, it's a little rough. So, but for all the other Enneatypes, it's, I think, a little more balanced, but
Okay.
it's still valid. I mean, what she's saying is is still valid, but yeah, you know, we all tend to be a little hard on ourselves. So, yeah, so those would be the ones I would recommend.
Okay, thank
And
you.
you know, there's other things out there too, but those would be to me, the foundations. And then, you know, Rizzo and Hudson have other books. Sandra has other books. So if you want to go deeper, there's other ways with those authors to go deeper that can expand your understanding.
And also just wanting to keep it in my mind as things come up. Like when I did it, I would think about it fairly often, and then I kind of forget about it. So just kind of I don't know,
Right.
this is just a good reminder to kind of bring it up and be thinking about it relative to the patterns and some of those things you mentioned. So
It is.
thank
It's
you.
one of those things you can just like make a circle back, you know, for literally decades, and it even gets more valuable, I think, as time goes on. The other thing I didn't mention about the Enneagram, for those of you who are new to it, like in Buddhism, we have the defilements and the hindrances. I mean, they're negative. Let's look at the words, defilement and hindrance. These aren't, you know, there's nothing good about them. But the Enneagram also is a reflection of our gifts that we bring to the world and our uniqueness and the, you know, the contribution that we make. So it has both the difficulties and the kind of fixation of our Enneatype, but it also has what we bring as we get more and more free. Those gifts can be offered more and more freely without us needing to be stuck in the ego. We're still, like, a fully enlightened person is still going to have an Enneatype. I mean, look at like Jesus and the Buddha. If you know, these are real different personalities, you know, real different. And yet they're both, you know, extremely evolved individuals. So there's a way where I like the Enneagram's honoring of what we are that you don't find so much in, well, you don't find it really at all in the defilements. So it's a way that we can also, you know, honor the gifts that we bring that are unique as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and that's good because I don't see any other hands up. And last time we did kind of a little experiment to see if there were people who might like to go into a breakout group would be shooting for 3 people per group for about 10 minutes to talk to other practitioners about, you know, if you're using the Enneagram, what's been useful about it, or, you know, what are you wondering about it? And if you haven't used it, how is this landing with you, what I'm saying? So how many of you are interested in going into a 10-minute triad with other people who are here? Just see a show of hands. Okay, let's see. I think we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so what we'll do then in a minute is that we will, for those of you who don't want to go into the breakout, we will conclude the night here. And my wish is that you find the Enneagram as a valuable tool that helps you to go deeper in your path and to use it as a way of finding a wide path back to your own deeper nature that got turned away from. So we will see those of you who don't want to be in a group next time. And lovely to be with you all. It's such a joy to have you here. So you can go ahead and drop off, and then those of you who want to be in a group can just stay on. And in a minute, Jeannie will put you into groups.